Hey, everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to let you know that Don't Split the Podcast Network is now selling t-shirts. We have t-shirts with our amazing, awesome logo on them and t-shirts with the classic, new classic ampersand design. You know, you might see them that say like Huey and Louie and Dewey, or Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael and Donatello, that kind of thing. There's an ampersand on the end of each line. They're really, really cool shirts. We have done them with strength and dexterity and constitution and intelligence and all the D&D stats in the 5th edition order. You can check it out. The t-shirts are $16 shipped anywhere in the continuous 48 United States. So check it out over at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com and click on store. Okay, let's start the show. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, I'm chatting with J.M. Perkins and Neal Powell about J.M. Perkins' Salt in the Wounds campaign setting. It is an amazing campaign setting with an awesome hook involving the Tarrasque. I'm going to let J.M. describe it to you because he does it so much better than me. And why do something palely and poorly that is going to happen right now? Okay, everybody, now I am here with two amazing humans and game designers. It is really awesome to have you both here. Welcome to Tabletop Babble. Neal Powell, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Too much, probably, if you ask my wife. The short and sweet answer would be the Dungeon Masters block being on the main show, as well as doing DMnastics, the gym for Dungeon Masters to work out their mind. We also have daily exercises you can check out on Twitter. Those are kind of the big things. Why I'm here today would be because I'm helping my good friend, J.M. Perkins, with his Kickstarter, Salt and Wounds, as the project manager.
Excellent, excellent. And that is, of course, our other guest today, J.M. Perkins. Who are you, and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, my name is J.M. Perkins. I am a writer and game designer. I did a lot of stuff for Pathfinder and Dungeons & Dragons, but now my big gig is the Salt and Wounds tabletop setting. We had a very successful Kickstarter, and pretty much all of my gaming design time is predicated on working on that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it is awesome to have both of you here. JM, this is the first time we are podcast talking.
Yeah.
And so that is really, really cool for me to have you on. I am a backer of the Salt and Wounds Kickstarter. It is a really, really awesome concept. And I brought you on today because it did super, super well. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
And it did well because the world is so cool and such a strong, amazing idea. So I thought, we should talk about world building today. We've got, the very buff DMnastics coach with us, and we've got J.M. Perkins, creator of Salt and Wounds. Like, we should talk about world building today, and we're going to talk a lot about Salt and Wounds. So before we dive into sort of world building advice and thoughts and things like that, tell me a little bit about Salt and Wounds so that the listeners know what we're talking about when we talk about this. Is a 5th edition D&D campaign setting, right?
Yeah, 5th edition in Pathfinder. So the basic pitch is this. If you're not familiar, in Dungeons & Dragons, pretty much every edition, there is kind of the monster, which is the Tarrasque. Imagine Godzilla, except in most editions, it can regenerate from any wound, and even if you manage to kill it, it just comes back. Well, in the world of Salt and Wounds, they had the problem with this rampaging kaiju, and because they couldn't kill it, they just bound it in one place. They managed to stick it in place with these magical harpoons. And then, because they were stuck up in the mountains and they started getting hungry and they didn't have supplies, they started eating it. And the city of Salt and Wounds is the city 200 and some odd years after that, where this crazy, evil megacity has grown up around the perpetual butchery of this bound Tarrasque. So that is the best quick summary I can do about this. It's the weird ecology around, oh, we couldn't kill this thing, now we're eating this thing. Hey, now we have an economy and a society built around this central premise.
It's so like a bizarre Las Vegas almost in that sense. Like, it's like here's an endless buffet of Tarrasque meat.
And probably tastes just as good, having gone to Vegas for almost 2 decades, because that's where my grandparents lived. Buffets are not great. I'm just going to tell you, it's quantity over quality.
It's definitely true. But sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes that doesn't matter. It sounds like, well, this is turning into a commercial for Las Vegas Tarrasque Town. So let's talk then a little bit about Salt and Wounds and how you came up with the idea for Salt and Wounds. Like, what was it about it? Were you like, man, this monster regenerates incredibly. I wonder what it tastes like. I could have endless steaks. Like, how did this idea come about?
Yeah, so I really like treating the weird rules in Dungeons and Dragons as a source of, well, how would this change society? For instance, I really like the concept of a shade apocalypse, where if you had the right program shades, they would quickly envelop the world because they can make more of themselves. Oftentimes in Dungeons and Dragons settings, we do this vaguely medieval setting. And then there's these magical creatures and magic, but it doesn't actually change society. And in developing Salt and Wounds, I'm always really fascinated on, okay, you treat the rules as written as fact. How would that actually change the society? How could that be exploited? How does that change the economy? How would this basically be hacked by scheming humans? And so that's the inspiration for a lot of my game writing, and that is also the inspiration for Salt and Wounds.
That's great. And I think, I think about that all the time with resurrection and raise dead spells, right? Which is one reason I was so happy to see Tomb of Annihilation come out, because it sort of deals with the fact that there are all these people who've been raised from the dead and what would happen if it suddenly stopped, right? But I also think you could take that a step further and say, all of a sudden diamonds are going to cost way more than they did, and people are going to be killing each other to get these things, and because it's it's a key to a second life for a lot of people. So it's pretty crazy. I love that that's the way you approach things and think about things. What is the sort of Salt and Wounds flavor? You said it's we think about medieval fantasy world. Do you think of it as a medieval fantasy world and it's changed because of the Tarrasque, or do you think it's a whole different thing? Is it inspired by another culture? What's it like?
Oh yeah. So when I was talking to our lead artist, I said it's definitely a polyglot society, and kind of the style notes I gave him was I want something between Norse practicality and like Ming Dynasty decadence, and just really trying to super collide these very different artistic tropes to really communicate that this is a polyglot society. One of the things I wanted to bring up is that basically for most of human history, at least since the agrarian revolution, getting enough calories was a major problem, and it required a ton of work. And so one of the big deformations that Salt and Wounds immediately has is food is plentiful to the point of being free. So how does that change society? What becomes valued? And of course, there's always consequences. So one of the things is that water is not cheap and free. And in fact, it's being tainted by what they're doing. It's always a balancing act between making your world relatable enough so that player characters have a sense of who they are and what they're doing here and what's of value. But also, I really try to turn up the fantasy as much as possible to show people something that they maybe have never seen before, but still feels real and has that verisimilitude.
I think a lot of people get those ideas. We read these wacky rules and it's like, oh man, what would it be like if flumps were really and it would change this way and we've been wearing them as mood rings or whatever else, right? So you are actually doing it, right? You're taking this and you're thinking it and you're going about it. So you sort of mentioned too, like you want to keep the balance there, you want to keep it fun, you want to keep it interesting. How far do you go? How far do you take this idea of the Tarrasque would change the world this way, and because this changes, then this changes, and because this changes, then this changes? How far out do you go? How many steps are you going before it's like, well, now I'm teaching a microeconomics lesson and I'm not playing D&D anymore? Where is that line?
I feel the good rule of thumb is that you react to problems and you do iterations up until the point where the player characters are most likely to make a big difference. right? So you could run these economic models to the point where, I mean, not really economic models, but you get the sense of like, oh, well, this causes this and this causes this, up to the point where no individual group could make a difference. And I think the sweet spot in world building is, how do you kind of nudge a world in such a direction that a small group of like 4 to 6 people who get very powerful can utterly have efficacy here, can utterly change how this place works and what's going on. Because I think if you stop, you can stop before that, and you can definitely go past it. But I think there's definitely a sweet spot. What do you think about that, Neal?
I think the Salt and Wounds has hit a sweet spot in that it's not necessarily changing the entirety of the world that it is set in, which is also a boon to it in that you could easily drop it into your world. And so it's changed the surrounding area, but not the world economy as a whole. So I think that kind of harkens to what JM just said, in that your adventuring party isn't addressing this world changing thing. They're addressing the problems that happen in a more localized area. So I think that that's one of definitely one of the ways to approach it, is that if it goes too far, then, like you mentioned, there's nothing they could do. And if it doesn't go far enough, well, then there's everything they can do.
And that, Neal, this brings me to another question that I wanted to ask you, because you do so much world building on DMnastics. How far out should we start when we're world building, right? Like, what's the way to start? I think one of the things that's great about Salt and Wounds is it's so focused on this one area, and it feels like there's so many things to do with just this one idea in this one area, right? How far out should we be zooming out when we start this process?
Yeah, and you also understand how difficult that question is to ask.
I do. That's why I'm asking it, not answering it.
So I think one of the biggest things is to look at both your group and yourself. I think a less experienced DM, it's great to look very small and make a subtle change, or even a subtle or stark change in what the basic understanding of like a fantasy setting is. And then that's why your area, your world is special to both you and your players interacting with it. And so if, again, the Shade Apocalypse idea, the start of that is something new and exciting and different, and now your players have to address it and try and contain it and do these certain things. Or adding a Tarrasque to the area and then having that change the economy surrounding it, and now it's the focus of what they can interact with. So I think starting small is one of the best ways to start, and then how far out you want to go is based on your personal preference, your players, and your experience with world building.
Yeah, one of the coolest fan contributions I got for Salt and Wounds was Salt and Steam, where they took it, another 500 years and made it a steampunk setting. And it was really, really cool. But it's literally kind of about your taste and like, where is that sweet spot for you for how much you've played with these ideas and how much you've shaped it.
Sure. And so JM, you're designing for a multitude of tastes, right? You're designing for the public, not just one gaming group. How did you land, and how did you start when you started this, and where did you sort of end up with the scope of it?
Well, so now this is a fascinating question. I've just read Tina Fey's Bossy Pants, and one of the things she talks about as in being, the showrunner for 30 Rock is that she had to suppress the creativity of others. And one of the things I think about with Salt and Wounds is it starts with this initial burst of, I'm writing it because I can't not write it, right? I'm so excited about this idea. I just want to do this stuff. And one thing leads to the other. And eventually you get to the point where you kind of have to, the other way I've heard it described is write drunk, edit sober. So especially when you're writing for the public, you can't include everything in because the things that you do include have to be sufficiently fleshed out and usable. So it's this balancing act between initial blush for enthusiasm, get lots done, and then eventually start pruning that down and just focusing on the core, because I'm not writing an encyclopedia for a fictional land. I'm trying to write a series of documents that will really help GMs and players play a great game. And it's all the information they need, some of the information they don't, but all of it as usable and as interesting as humanly possible.
I like that a lot. So let's talk a little bit then about designing worlds for other people, right? That is what you are doing primarily. And that's sort of what you were just talking about, right? Is what you're thinking about. And when you're writing drunk and editing sober, which I really like, I think that's a great way to put it. What are some lessons you've learned? Have you had to kill any darlings as you have been going through this?
Oh, I most definitely have killed some darlings.
We have a pile in the back. Don't worry about it. I try and hide them.
Uh-huh.
Supplements for the future, for sure.
Yeah. So killing darlings for sure. Focusing on the most important core first, for sure. There was definitely a period where I started thinking about like the larger world and kind of these design principles and how it would affect a world. And, I would start writing that. And I'm like, no, this is the edit sober part. So definitely maybe not kill the darlings, but seal them up in a tomb where I might release them later has been a thing. One of the big things about writing for the people, I think of the essay, I believe it's The 8 Kinds of Fun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where it's basically that different people at the table want different things. So some people, when you're talking about like Dungeons and Dragons or a tabletop RPG, they really want like tactical combat. That's what most interests them. Some people really want, completely immersed role play. Some people really want to tell silly jokes with their friends around the table. Some people really like sensory props, right? They're really about the detailed map and maybe some interesting smells. Even, one thing we did for that was like terrace jerky. So when I'm designing for other people as opposed to myself, I'm really trying to hit as many different of those types of fun as possible. And hopefully you can include the link in the show notes. But I thought it was a fascinating essay just to understand that, okay, when you go to the table, you have certain things that you especially enjoy. And there might be things that you don't especially enjoy, but are super meaningful to others. And I think one of the tricks is in making a commercial product is getting beyond your personal preferences and trying to do as good a job with what you're doing as possible. And for me, that means trying to at least keep in mind all the different ways people have fun at a table.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think it's important to start with an idea that excites you because I'm sure, as you both know, you will be working on it for a long time.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about mechanical stuff because I think we, in the role-playing game world, we sort of equate building a couple mechanics, be they, small homebrew rules modules, a couple of feats or spells or magic items or whatever, to entire new classes as part of our world building as well. I understand that is also part of this process. Is that right, guys?
Oh, very much so.
Yes. I was to say very, very much so, which I mean, because that's one of the key things is the interaction with the Tarrasque, especially the consumption of a creature of this caliber, is going to change everything about everyone that interacts with it in that way. And so, yes, there are many, many things that have changed. I mean, I don't even know what specifically we would want to highlight, so I'll leave that to JM and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So I will confess that I am a competent rule designer, but I'm not great, especially considering the company I keep. And I'm much more interested in using the game design components to create interesting hooks. So to give you an example of kind of how we do that. So the first 2 supplements we released already for Salt and Wounds is I did Design Notes, which was a collection of essays, mostly about game design and running a table and such. It's really about Salt and Wounds and my design process for that. The next one we released was The Corruption of the Tarrasque, which is the idea that because this thing has been alive for multiple centuries and its blood is seeping into the water table, that regenerating blood has mutagenic effects. So it's causing disease and it's causing people to mutate. And it's also a primordial bloodline for sorcerers. And all of those in the supplement about this is how interaction with the mutagenic blood is changing people. The next one we're releasing this month is Carving Up the Tarrasque, which is all about, okay, so they've been carving up this thing and they eat it, but also here are the alchemical things they're building out of this Tarrasque. Here are the crafting things they're building out of the Tarrasque. And so you have these concepts of how this changes the worlds and options for players, and all of those are bound into a mechanic. Of course, in the the months to come, we're releasing the campaign setting guide, which will have some new custom monsters. Some of them are native to this area and they don't really exist elsewhere. With the player's guide, there will be backgrounds or traits in your Pathfinder okay, so if your character's from here or just visiting, here are some of the personality qualities or the traits that they'll have that will affect how they move through the game world. And then the bigger project, of course, which is almost done, is a 5e and Pathfinder customization for all the standard classes. So it's the Sorcerer Bloodline, it's the Warlock Patron, and giving them all something that is both unique, mechanically compelling, but also fits into the game world as someone you could totally see operating in this kind of city.
Wow. I have a question. Just want to circle back to that Warlock Patron. Who is the Warlock Patron in this setting?
Well, I feel like JM has been very deliberate in the things that he's discussed so far, because those are the things that quick backstory. So I was originally hired as a freelance designer, writer for... Well, okay, let's take it even a step further. I was just a backer, just like you, James. And then JM contacted me. I came on as a freelance writer and then eventually came on as a project manager. But the Warlock Patron is actually something that I wrote.
Oh, excellent. Yes.
So the Warlock Patron is the Lord of Agony, because the constant butchering of the Tarask itself is essentially so severe that it created an entity in and of itself because of that torment. So there's this focus on that agony and essentially like using worst practice. Like that's one of the goals of this Lord of Agony, is to use the most painful methods by which to butcher the Tarask to essentially foster and create more power in itself.
Yeah. So exactly what Neal said. I can loop the game design mechanic conversation back into some of the earlier questions you were asking about game design. So one of the things I think that we've done a really good job of for Salt Moons is kind of having themes that we're exploring and having them plug in. So one of the themes is, I guess, for lack of a better word, the theme of pollution. Right. So on the one level, the Jurassic blood is polluting. It's twisting the land. And then there's all kinds of subsidiary effects from that. And so you talk about how that's mutating people and how that's making people sick potentially, and they can't get water to drink that's safe. And then also you take that same theme and you turn it into class mechanics. And then hopefully you can go one step beyond the obvious. So the obvious pollution would be the blood. Well, what about its pain as pollution? And you turn that into game mechanics where it's twisting the Fae in the local area, where they are being basically driven insane and being twisted by this psychic emanation of this thing's pain. And then also, you turn that pollution into a vested interest. In the case of blood, there is a swamp that just feeds on the blood runoff. In the case of the Warlock Patron, Tesca, the Lord of Agony, it's literally a sentient creature that is the embodiment and is the thing that feeds upon the Tarask pain. So that's an example of how you take a theme that you want to explore. And the reason I want to explore those themes, of course, is part of my personal reasons for doing Salt Moons is I want to explore my tensions around industrial farming, because I'm very much a carnivore, but I think that the way we kind of torture animals on an industrial scale bothers me. And so what if you consolidate that down into a relationship a city has with a single creature, right? And you just turn it up to a level and be a fantasy lens. And trying to loop the themes and tensions, both in the world design, in the tensions the everyday people are going through, and then in monster design / character design. I think that's a really sweet spot to tie everything together.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it sounds like you're really letting the story lead your design, that you're saying, this is a cool thing. Where does this fit? As opposed to saying, I need a barbarian class. What should we do? Right?
Yeah, exactly. It's what does that class, looking at these themes and tensions, what's the natural outflow? So like the example is the barbarian class that we did do. They're using the idea of the scarred beast as a totem, right? This thing that just will not die. That's their totem, because you can imagine someone with a barbarian mindset coming to the city, seeing this thing. That's what they respect. That just incredible resiliency. And then you look at maybe a Pelham coming to the city, and their idea is what's admirable here is that these people have managed to contain a great evil. So that's an oath of binding, right? Like that's what they admire. That's what they get out of this. That's how they develop.
Yeah, I love that. I love that it's sort of how would the various classes, sort of the what we think of as an archetypical paladin or an archetypical barbarian, see this crazy thing going on, and how would that change their life, and how would they respond to it? Is really a cool idea. I love that.
Yeah. Well, and it's that's something we try to keep for all the classes. The druid, they're really fascinated by this basically engineered ecosystem outside the city to deal with the Tarrasque runoff, right? And so they're fascinated by the fungus that grows only there. And so that's their circle, is the fungus. The rogues are very, and this was a customization designed by Rich Howard, they're very much more thug-like, right? They're more enforcers. They're kind of much more steeped in being muscle for the criminal enterprises. And just that's true for every single class customization.
That's a great way to think about it. And I know because you've got people like Rich Howard and Neal on this project that you have people who are really thinking about story, and then also great designers. So they're putting together something amazing.
Don't go anywhere. There's more Tabletop Babble coming up.
Hey, it's Mike Shea of Sly Flourish and author of The Lazy Dungeon Master and Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations. My show, The DM's Deep Dive on the Don't Split the Podcast Network, features a one-on-one discussion with guests like Sean Merwin, Enrique Bertrand, Teos Abadia, and more. Once a month, we dive deep into a single D&D topic and answer your burning DM questions. Watch us live on Twitch, on YouTube, or on our podcast on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Let's dive deep.
All right, back to the show.
Neal, how much was the story driving your own design of these things? You know, when you sat down to make this warlock, like when you get into the details of picking the bonus spells the warlock is going to have and that sort of thing, how much does that drive those choices versus it'd be cool to have lightning bolt?
Yeah, you honestly picked the most difficult piece of design in that class for me was choosing those spells and making sure that, to me, it felt like that was right based on their patron being this Lord of Agony. Like, I think I toiled over that small, already predefined area more than any other piece of the design, was making sure that it felt like this is exactly what their patron would want them to be doing. This is what would cause the most agony in people opposing this warlock.
Yeah, I think that's so many spells deal damage, right? You could argue that many deal pain, right? But thinking about what fits an agony theme is different, right? It's got to be more evocative than just 2d4 damage or whatever.
Oh, very much so. And then, of course, Neal did a great job of balancing, like, fit the theme, but also make sure that you are designing a class that can stand toe-to-toe with the other great classes, just in terms of pure power. Because, that's a type of fun that some people just want a power game. But you have to give them a way to feel powerful without breaking the game. And Neal did a great job of, threading that needle.
I can dip into one of the special abilities I gave it if we want.
We do want.
Okay. So at level 10, the warlock would receive the Conduit of Pain. And essentially any ally within 30 feet, when they're damaged, you can choose to try and take on and redirect that pain. You essentially try and redirect it back at who caused it. And if they pass a charisma save, you essentially take that instead. So there's essentially it's flow. You're using that pain to flow through you and maybe put it back on the person that caused it, or maybe you take it. Who knows?
Wow, that's awesome. I love that so much. I really want to play this now.
Well, and I will say sometimes at least when I do the design, sometimes it's easier because there's flesh golems and then you have a bunch of trash flesh flying around. So, hey, would anyone try to make a flesh golem out of Tarrasque flesh? And what would that look like?
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, I never thought about that. That's true. You've got all sorts of construct material that you can tear off the Tarrasque to make great flesh golems. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, and having designed that, it informed just a little detail I made of the world, which is for Salt and Wound's crime and punishment is mostly they cut off limbs or take eyes. And so, there's a thriving marketplace for human eyes for these Tarrasque flesh golem construct. They generally have mismatched eyes because they're from two different people.
Wow. That is messed up and awesome. It's so cool. So you obviously are very inspired by this material. You've really thought about it. You're taking it into the design. It's in the monsters. It's in the class options, which is amazing. When you are designing, so I find when I'm sort of designing a piece of the world, I'm constantly thinking about quest hooks and adventure hooks and that sort of thing, because why am I putting something in a book for a dungeon master if they're not going to use it, right? If it's not going to be part of a quest or part of a thing like that. When you do that, are you constantly doing that as well? Are you constantly like jamming as many story hooks and interesting things into your work as you can?
Yeah, that's definitely a design goal. Is I'm not interested in non-actionable trivia. Like every piece of information in this book, it's my goal that it could totally inspire an adventure, an encounter, a dilemma that player characters get in. And to loop this back to some of your earlier questions about the iterative process, two of the ways I conceive of it is this idea of unexploded ordnance, right? So you have this landscape, you have this setting, right? And as part of the process of developing it, there's a metaphoric bomb that never went off and no one ever defused it. And I got this idea from, in World War II, they would just drop thousands of bombs. And every once in a while, they find one, even nowadays. And someone has to go defuse it. And I love this concept of, because of what's happened, whether magical mishaps, whether battles, whether great tragedies, whether whatever it is, there's just these things around that like, that's going to blow up in somebody's face. And hopefully it will be the PCs, and hopefully we'll get an adventure out of it. The other thing, to loop back into your earlier questions about the iterative process and trying to make every little detail as compelling as possible, is the idea that I think this adds to verisimilitude, and also it naturally leads itself to plot hooks, is every problem is a solution to a different problem, right? So in broad strokes for Salt and Wounds, the problem is that you have this Tarrasque that you can't kill. Okay, so the solution is to bind it in place. Okay, now the problem is we have to keep people around because we still can't keep it and it might get out if it doesn't get out. Okay, now the problem is, how do you feed those people? Okay, so the solution is they eat the Tarrasque. Okay, now the problem is once you have an economy based on eating the Tarrasque, that's kind of evil and weird, or it has other side effects, and then those are problems. And so in making adventure hooks compelling, if you solve one problem, you potentially have to go back and solve the problem before it, right? Because that problem was a solution to a different problem. And you just have this stack of really easy hooks of like, so people are mutating horribly. So you solve that, but then is it going to come back? And then you have to look at further down the source.
That's a really, really cool way to think about it. And you can just never have too many adventure hooks. So I have a question for you, which is, as you're designing this world, as you're thinking about Salt and Wounds, do you ever leave anything open? Like have a mystery, essentially, that you don't give the answer to? Maybe you'll suggest some different things to the GM, but there's no permanent solution. Do you have a lot of those? I love to drop those in there too,
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something I'm still learning how to balance and still try to feel out, because there are definitely GM styles where they want to know what is the correct answer. They want to know what is the factual answer, and they want you to be that authority. That has never been the way that I've GM'd. I love experiencing gaps when I'm ingesting a setting, because I will fill in myself, right? I will figure out what's the most compelling thing for my table. And so one of the things I do is I err on the side of giving more information, but I'm very clear, like, look, this is your player's mystery. Here's how we're quote unquote officially solving it. But if you have something better, do that. You're the authority, you're the creator, and no one knows your table better than you do. So if you have a better idea I'm actually very clear about this in the setting guide several times. Look, if you're a player, you can read the setting guide. There's a secret section. Don't read that. But you can read the setting guide. But if your GM ever says anything that contradicts this, your GM is right.
That's really cool. That's a great way to go about it too. Because I think even, players love to consume this stuff too. And I want to encourage my players to like learn more about the world, right? So that I don't have to give a lecture every time we encounter something new.
Yeah. Well, and frankly, like players can help build that world. GMs have to keep track of so many things. It's nice sometimes when I'm running a table that the player will remind me, oh yeah, there's this guy here, or there's this here. And I welcome that. I also welcome their ideas. That said, though, when you're doing the commercial design, for me, I bias towards it needs to be as fully fleshed out and as usable as possible. And for some GMs, even though it's not my personal play style, that means having a quote unquote canon answer for everything, or just about everything that they can refer to.
Neal, what play style DM are you?
I don't answer anything. I'm going to be honest. I really don't, just because that I just let my players who I know I've mentioned it to you before, James, where two of my players are the people that got me into this 20 years ago. So their ability to come up with stuff, and I think that's, and kind of JM's approach as well to the design is like, there's so many great people out there. And that's how I view my own table is like, I don't hold the keys to anything, really. I'm just kind of judge and jury. And if I get to kill a character, well, fantastic. But if not, that's okay too. But I like them answering those questions to better develop the world that they want to see. And that's in my mind the biggest difference between commercial and personal.
Yeah,
definitely. I think that's huge. So let's talk a little bit about art. I think as we sit down to design our worlds,
yes.
right, we all want to see art for the things we create. And when you're publishing your world, you pretty much have to provide art for the things that you are creating. Neal, you seem pretty pumped to talk about the art. So let's talk about the art. What is this art all about? Because it is awesome.
It's all about going to Twitter and following at Jeff Chin Designs and giving him all kinds of amazing praise because he is amazing at what he does. And honestly, like it's one of the key things that drew me in, like his ability to show what the world has become surrounding this giant creature, and that just everyday life is happening as we understand it. And there is a Tarrasque not a mile away from your home. But that's okay because that's just the way it's been and that's just the way we live. Like his ability to capture that with what kind of like, I would say, and JM could probably corroborate, like the key piece of art that we see as Salt and Wounds has the ability to really tell you what this world is in just that single piece of art.
Yeah, Jeffrey Chin, I can't speak highly enough of his work. It's incredible. And I think that Neal is absolutely right in saying, as a player, this is this alien metropolis that's super weird, and oh my gosh, it's a Tarrasque, and how can they do that? For the people living in the city, it's just life. And he does such a remarkable job capturing that. And, so I have a very clear idea of what I want, and he's incredibly good at taking that direction. And occasionally he does something that surprises me and improves upon any idea I had. And it's just incredible. And I mean, just like little stuff. Like, again, I told him, to give you a sense of like what that interplay looks like on the ground is like, I'm like, okay, so I want you to make a Tarrasque butchery diagram. And so here are the references, like look at like, a Chinese acupuncture or acupuncture diagram where there's like these weird meridian lines of like energy flows. But I want you to do kind of that. But I want you to do a character set that is halfway between, again, with our style notes of Ming Dynasty and Norse, halfway between the Elder Futhrak rune set and Chinese holograms. I forget what they're called, the characters. And he just whips out this entire like symbol set as the background for this diagram. And then I get to take that and incorporate those characters and those symbols into other work and have this crazy cool reference that he built based on a sentence or two that I gave him.
I think another good example is the trueness of the term, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And my ability to do that, I mean, it's actually closer to 1300 when I was done, but that's beside the point. So one of the other things is that he has designed the iconic characters for us as well. So recently I took the task of writing the backstory to the iconic fungal druid. And so I just took his design, and with what I felt like was the greatest of ease, I just on one screen had that up and was writing the backstory, and I cranked out 1300 words in what felt like no time at all. Like, it felt good to write that story because it was like the art was asking me to do it.
Yeah. And on the subject of iconics, so we're doing our last push for pre-orders. The backer kit will be closed down this month, so if anyone still wants to order, now's your last chance to get at that price. And as part of that promotion, we're doing all the iconic characters to give people a better sense of like, okay, here's what the art looks like, here's kind of the stories you can tell, and also here are those character class customizations we talked about. And I was really happy to do, and the only character iconic not done by Jeffrey Chen, is I did an iconic character, which was designed by artist Matt Hiker, and that is also awesome.
And I think that's the key thing about finding an artist that you work well with. No matter what their style is, it needs to function well with your style. And I think both JM and I approach a very let the artist be the artist. And I think Jeffrey feeds off of that well. I think when I prompted him to do the cover art for the player's guide, I think we maybe had a couple sentences go back and forth, and it felt like he took exactly what I wanted and made it into so much more. So I think that it's really key to find artists that function on the same kind of like ideas that you do, so that it works as well as it can.
Yeah, that's very true. I love that philosophy, right, of letting the artists be the artists. And I think writing an art order so that you get what you want, but also allow the artist freedom to surprise you is a skill in and of itself, right? So when you're writing those art orders, you said JM 1-2 sentences. How do you what do you include in that, and what do you let the artist decide?
Yeah, so a couple things that I've definitely included for the iconics is I definitely included clear instructions that I want a range of genders and races, both in terms of fantasy races, but also diversity of human ethnicity. I included like a one-sentence synopsis of like what the character was. So for these ones, the iconics was easy because they're all based on the class customizations. So, this is a fungus druid, right? And I let him choose the race, but this is a fungus druid, and 2 sentences about that. One of the ones was a little bit hard. I was trying to communicate about the sorcerer bloodline because they're basically they're a little bit harder to explain. The idea for the lore is that the Tarask is actually originally like the Titan class being that precedes the gods. And basically they were just these crazy artists that just did things because they could before he was cursed with whatever happened to Tarask. And so the idea is the bloodline, they're kind of tilted towards being fops, where they're just dandies and they just do creative things and they're kind of ADHD. And that one was a little hard. It would require a little back and forth to kind of get it right. But for pretty much everything else, it's 2 sentences. Here's what this class does. Here's who this character could be. And then he creates the art. And then from there, I actually make the story to turn that into a person, right? As opposed to just the character class based on what he showed me in the art.
Nice. That is incredible. So I love that sort of creativity feeding into each other, right? That it goes from you to him, back to you, and like all of this amazing stuff is happening. I also want to say I have gotten the iconic Salt and Wounds Commoner, and this is some awesome art, y'all. You should check it out right now. We'll include it actually in the show notes for this episode over at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, as long as that's okay with you all. So yeah, this is really, really incredible stuff. Salt and Wounds, I am just so happy I've backed it. Everything that I have seen is just so awesome, so inspired, and it's even better than I had hoped, and it sounds awesome to begin with. I have to ask, is there any possibility that Tarask can get loose?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're doing as part of the Kickstarter is we're doing the adventure path. And the adventure path terminates in the Tarasking out. And if you're doing it in your own game, there's these 13 magical harpoons, and each of them has a command word. And each one is potentially a major dilemma to get that command word. But hypothetically, if someone was there and they had all the command words and they released it, the Tarrasque would be freed. And just its tailing loose a couple years ago, it threw up a bunch of rocks and boulders and kind of decimated a section of the city. So, yeah. Also, in the lore, one of the things about Salt and Wounds is the way they've avoided being invaded, because they're very wealthy, is they had an approaching army. They're like, you turn around or we're going to let Tarrasque out. And they kind of have this, mad style nuclear deterrent of like, oh, you want to attack us? Literally, the Tarrasque will be free. We'll die. Your army will die. And have fun with that.
So now are other people trying to get their own kaiju to sort of in a Cold War style escalation?
Well, that is kind of the bigger world that, who knows when I'll have time to work on it. But the idea for Sonoma, because I built Salt and Wounds so you could plug it into your world, right? It's kind of
which is amazing.
A bit of a bubble city. So I have notes on like, oh, here's where it can fit. If you want to interact with the larger economy, here's how it can. If you don't, here's how that looks like, because either one works given this weirdness of the city. But kind of what I'm doing with the official world as part of Sonoma is the idea that they're in a magical Cold War where different nation states have access to magic that is equivalent to a nuclear weapon. And so there's no overt war, but everyone's trying to do this cloak and dagger game. They're trying to foment revolutions in people's kingdoms. They're trying to figure out where dungeons and ruins are and secretly plumb them. So that nobody else can get the advanced magic that is hidden there. And it's basically geopolitically situated like, oh, there's Cold War. There's no overt war anymore, but there's tons of intrigue. And that's kind of what adventurers are.
Wow. You guys are just so clever and incredible. And I love that I can take this thing and I can drop it into a campaign that I've been running for a while. Like, I don't need to wait. I don't need to start over to use it, right? I can integrate it into the story. Oh yeah, you guys want to hop on that ship and go across the sea? Guess what? You land in a city with a Tarrasque as its main piece of the economy. I love that. So this is Salt in Wounds. Where can people find you and find out more about Salt in Wounds, JM?
Yeah, so I am Jim Perkins on Twitter, and one of my new resolutions is to be more active on Twitter. Just saltandwoundssetting.com. That was the blog I ran for about a year before doing the Kickstarter. And it also has links to the Kickstarter and the backer kit so you can pre-order. And that's where we're posting the iconics over the course of the month. And that will pretty much have links to everything. And I should point out, of course, I am doing, the professional bound book version of all this stuff. But there is, I don't know, probably a novel's worth of material that's free and available that you can just start using right now. Because I was writing this for a year and a half, and that will stay up. But of course, I'll clean it up a bit. But we're also doing the books if you want all the stats and all the cool art and everything that comes with it.
Well, where can people find you, Neal Powell?
If you want to hear my dulcet tones, you could go search your podcaster of choice and search for the Dungeon Masters block where you can hear me. If you want to hear me having edited something, you could go listen to the YJ files with our great mutual friend, Rich Howard, talking about Young Justice. I'm sure there's other stuff that I do that you could find. My Twitter handle is awful and no one can understand when I say it, but it's Jote Moniac, like Jack of all trades, master of none.
Mm-hmm. Like the amazing Bruce Campbell show, Jack of all trades.
Exactly. 100% it was not my motivation, but I like it. So you can find me on Twitter. That's where I am definitely most active.
Excellent. And we will include all of that information over in the show notes at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. Please do come again to talk to us more about Salt and Wounds and world building and just how awesome y'all are. Hey everybody, Tabletop Babble is starting its second year and we could use your help growing. Log on to iTunes, leave us a review, and we will get rated and recommended in other people's podcast feeds. Seriously, even if you don't have iTunes, it's free to create an account and odds are your podcatcher app is using these iTunes algorithms. Create a free account in like 30 seconds, rate us, and then all of the other podcasts you listen to. We would so appreciate it. And to encourage you to do just that. I will read one new 5-star review verbatim and credit the person who left it. Today's 5-star review comes from Crazed Artist, and it is entitled Worth It. And Crazed Artist says, I'm a busy DM and I only have so many hours to listen to podcasts, but I make sure to catch every episode of this show's great interviews and discussions. Jen/Pixelscapes. Oh my gosh. Okay, so Crazed Artist is Jen Pixelscapes, who you should find on Twitter. She is doing these amazing stylistic drawings of the Monster Manual tokens right now. So follow her on Twitter at Pixelscapes. Jen, thank you so much for leaving this review. Really appreciate your support, and I love your artwork. It is so amazing. Go check her out. Or you could head on over to pixelscapes.com. She's also there as well. You know, Don't Split the Podcast Network had an awesome year last year, and we added a great podcast I want to tell you all about. The first 2 episodes of the Newbie DM mini-cast are up right now. You can subscribe on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, and all the usual places. You can even listen over at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. It features Newbie DM Enrique Bertrand, talking to celebrity DM hosts such as myself and Rudy Basso. Each episode is about 10 minutes long. Newbie DM and his guests answer one particular burning question that a listener has, and then they're off to the races. It's amazing bite-sized chunks from Newbie DM, who is truly a master. Enrique Bertrand is awesome. We're so excited to have it on the network. Go check it out at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. People, if you're interested in the things I'm doing, you can follow me on Twitter at James Introcaso, or you can read all about my game design philosophy, my homebrew content, and other upcoming projects I have, like on the DMs Guild or with third-party publishers, over at worldbuilderblog.com. That's worldbuilderblog.com. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by BattleBards. Don't forget that RPGs are like sex. It's very important that you multi-class. Hey everybody, just wanted to take a quick break to let you know about the sponsor for this episode of Tabletop Babble. I'm talking about Kobold Press. Kobold Press is a third-party design company for RPG products with a range of books and supplements on monsters, adventures, and settings for both Pathfinder and D&D. The Kobold-in-Chief is Wolfgang Bauer, a well-known game designer who has been on this show and got his start writing for Dungeon Magazine back in 1991. Well, Kobold Press now brings you The Wrath of the River King. It's a 5th edition D&D adventure that has awesome Feywild flavor. When a local miller's wife goes missing, he begs the adventurers to search for her in the realm of the Feylands and its summer court. Here, the elves are cruel and cunning and look down on humans, dwarves, and others as little more than talking animals. Your players will have to explore the very alien world of the Fey, a place with different natural phenomenon, laws, and customs very different from the material world, as they try to save the miller's wife and solve the mystery of where she went. Wrath of the River King offers a lot of exploration, flavor, and encounters that are required to think outside the box. Your players will be challenged and you will love it. So will they. It's all about using your wits, and you're not just hacking at things with swords. You got to think through this one, which is great. That's the mark of a great adventure. You can get Wrath of the River King over at www.koboldpress.com, DriveThruRPG, or Paizo.com. And if you go on over to koboldpress.com, you can also download a free map. So check it out over at koboldpress.com. There's also a link to Wrath of the River King if you click on the banner on the left-hand side over at don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com. Thank you so much to Kobold Press for sponsoring this episode of Tabletop Babble.